Good afternoon. I hope everybody had a good weekend. Let me just sort of say at the outset that this lecture will be a bit shorter than the past ones have been, mainly because I'm assuming that you spent some of class time today doing today's quiz. So be sure that you do the quiz. And this lecture should be, I'm not completely positive how long I'll be talking for, but not much more than 15 or 20 minutes. And then, of course, we'll resume later this week. So just a few announcements before we get started. Please remember to do the quiz. If you did not do the quiz in the time allotted, be in touch with me, and I'll see if I can make an arrangement for that. Please remember to do the Flipgrid assignment. It's important that you do those. I do try and send out timely notifications of those. So most people have done them, but not everybody. So I ask that you remember to do that. Furthermore, a few people have given me feedback on the idea of having an optional, and I underline optional, synchronous Zoom session for the Friday class. So I may send out another query to all of you to get your thoughts about that. But I am planning on doing that. Let me just sort of make a quick comment about what my expectation is. I think basically what I will do is say that for Friday's class, you either have the option of doing the lecture for that day via a synchronous Zoom session, where I will send you a Zoom link. I will do my talk live with you, and we'll ask questions and discuss the material as we do in class. Or you can do an online lecture that I will make available. So you are not required to do the Friday Zoom session. There's no expectation that you do it. I just know that some students would like to have as much engagement with the actual class as possible. So I'm offering this in order to accommodate that desire. Finally, let me just say that we will be starting a new unit today on Mesopotamian/Sumerian culture. There will be a reading that is connected to this, which is the Epic of Gilgamesh. I imagine that some of you have read that before. I will be making an online version of that text available later today. We will be reading the whole epic, and I will be assigning sections of that from class to class starting today. So there is a reading assignment in the Epic of Gilgamesh for Wednesday, as there will be for Friday and Wednesday of next week. And then finally, note that the next assignment will be a short essay. At the end of each unit, you either have a quiz like you did for today, or a short essay. It will be a short essay for this unit, and that is due by the end of the day, I believe, of Wednesday, September 9th, which is next week. I will make that available and talk more about that later this week. Rather, I will make the prompt available, and as you learn, so that you can be thinking about the question as you do the reading and as I give the lectures. Okay, so that being said, I'd like to just reflect a little bit on what we've done so far, and then introduce the current the current unit, the new unit. We've been talking about Stone Age societies and the Lascaux cave paintings in particular. And what I hope that I have illustrated, particularly through the 4 theories of Stone Age art that we considered at the end of last week, that first of all, that cultural works of cultural expression, such as paintings, can be interesting inroads to understanding a past society. We certainly talked about the Lascaux people's material conditions, the way that they survived, what we know about their social organization, their time frame, and so on. But we, in a sense, kind of enriched that understanding by examining a feature of their society that can't be analyzed in purely factual terms, namely their painting. And the reason why it can't be understood in purely factual terms, of course, is because painting is by its very nature interpretive. It's a kind of code that we have to then decode, and that act of coding and of encoding and decoding, as I've said now on numerous occasions, is essentially interpretive, or to use a fancier term, hermeneutic. And the study of culture is necessarily interpretive or hermeneutic. And another sort of interesting feature of that is that to analyze, in a sense, the paintings, we have to look at interpretations that scholars have proposed and simply try and assess the merits of those interpretations, which is another way of saying there's no definitive answer. There's no final and certain answer as to what the meaning of those cultural expressions are. And it may be that it's in the nature of culture that the question of its meaning can never be stated with sort of finality. But hopefully you've gotten some sense of what some possible interpretations of that artwork might be. In the coming days, we're going to be studying a different society, ancient Sumerian society, which I might occasionally call ancient Mesopotamian society, and we're going to be looking at it through a cultural work too. In this case, not a painting, but a work of literature, what some have called one of the first works of world literature, if that term has any meaning, the Epic of Gilgamesh. And I will be talking about that this week, and you'll be reading excerpts of Gilgamesh from class to class. So today I just want to have a brief lecture that sort of gives you a few basics about who the Sumerians were, where they fit into a sort of longer story of human history, and to just give you some sort of really brief background to the society that I will then elaborate on Wednesday and later this week. So you'll notice that I introduce this with the term Mesopotamian and Sumerian culture. Let's first think about where does this society fit in relation to the Stone Age societies that we've been talking about up till now. Sorry, I briefly had a PowerPoint problem. So in order to understand who they are, let me just backtrack for a moment and talk about the world of hunter-gatherers, which I'm going to call a world before civilization. And I don't mean that in a disparaging way. I think I've tried to emphasize the fact that in many ways the hunter-gatherers are a quite complex society with a form of social organization, a developed form of economic activity, extensive stone tool making technology, and of course a really quite sophisticated and complex form of artwork that's tied to equally complex and sophisticated belief systems. But they do not, at least according to some scholars, count as a civilization. So that term civilization is one that I also want us to explore in the coming days, and to think about what the difference is between civilization and a hunter-gatherer society. So let me then sort of just remind you then of a basic term that I've used previously, Paleolithic. The Lascaux people are Paleolithic, or belong to a Paleolithic age. Remember, that term means old stone. As I've said before, the longest and most familiar, you might say, form of social organization that our species, Homo sapiens sapiens, has had is living as hunter-gatherers. This phase, which is the Paleolithic age, extended from around 1 million years ago to around 2000 BCE, before the Common Era, i.e. 12,000 years ago. I'm not trying to say that that entire period was Homo sapiens sapiens, but that also included some species that evolved before that, before our species. And what the term Paleolithic means is basically stone tools plus hunting and gathering. Okay, what really defines the Paleolithic age is not simply stone tools, but also the fact that people are living as hunters and gatherers. Other characteristics of this society is that, of course, it's cultural. We see the stone tools, the religious rituals, and the art. But a major feature of this society is that humans are completely dependent or largely dependent on their environment, primarily because of the fact that they organize themselves and settle themselves based on the availability of herds of animals and plants and berries and nuts that are in season. When those are not available, you have to move, and that to me is a major marker of sort of an environmental dependence. So to understand what we mean by the term civilization and to understand what's different about the Sumerians compared to the Lascaux people, you need to understand this term Neolithic. Okay, it's similar to the last word Paleolithic in the sense that you have the word lith in both. Lith meaning stone, but whereas Paleolithic means the Old Stone Age, Neolithic means the New Stone Age. And I'd like to explain what this means. First of all, it's obviously at a later point. It occurs very, very roughly around 10,000 BCE, before the Common Era, meaning again 12,000 years ago, in the Near East, i.e. what we roughly call today the Middle East. And you might argue that the Neolithic Revolution is the single greatest change in human life in the history of our species. You don't have to accept that sort of rather extreme point that I'm making, but it's not unreasonable to accept it, because it refers to the massive economic change as well as the massive change simply in the way that human beings live and organize all aspects of their life that results from the invention of two related activities: agriculture, i.e. farming, and animal domestication. In other words, if the Paleolithic Revolution is stone tools plus hunting and gathering, the Neolithic Revolution is stone tools plus farming and animal domestication. In other words, in this context, human beings have learned how to farm and to control regular herds of animals, and once they have done so, there's just a number of really important changes that occur, the most important of which is settlement. Humans cease to be primarily nomadic or even semi-nomadic and become settled creatures. Why? For the obvious reasons that their crops are near them. They are changing the environment to ensure the availability of the foodstuffs they grow, rather than having to travel to where those foodstuffs are. So this means greater control of the environment and also a flourishing of culture in the sense that we have been using the term as these forms of cultural or these forms of symbolic expression. So, and the picture shows the remains of a Neolithic settlement near the famous Stonehenge site in Britain. And the key thing, of course, to understand is that you have genuine settlement when we're in the Neolithic period. It's no longer just campsites that mark a kind of temporary stayover in a particular location. We're talking about human beings actually making permanent residence in certain locations, again, because of their proximity to farmlands of various kinds. So let me say then a word then about what we mean by the Sumerians of Mesopotamia. One reason why I've chosen to emphasize them is that the Sumerians are a good example of a Neolithic society, of a society that has gone through the Neolithic Revolution. And we'll also see that the term Neolithic, i.e. the invention of farming and animal domestication, has an important connection to the term civilization. So let me just define our terms, first of all. Who are the Sumerians? And first of all, what is Mesopotamia? Mesopotamia is the place. Mesopotamia is the land that we're going to be talking about for the next couple of classes. It's a Greek term that means between the rivers. And if you look at the map on my slide, you'll see that there are two rivers at the center of it. One that is sort of slightly more to the north and is called the Tigris, and another one that is a little bit to the south of it is called the Euphrates. Mesopotamia is a Greek term that means between the rivers, and the rivers in question are the Tigris and the Euphrates. So this land is located in modern-day Iraq, a modern country, of course, that many of you have heard of, although I note that my students were probably a little bit more familiar with Iraq a decade ago when the United States had still had a significant military presence there, which is less and less the case. In terms of the part of the world that we're talking about, roughly if you go northwest of this map, you will find yourself in Western Europe. If you go north or northeast, you'll find yourself in Asia. And of course, this land is itself part of Asia. It's the sort of southwestern corner of Asia. If you go to the southeast, you'll be in Africa. You can see the where the map says Lower Egypt, which of course would be part of Africa. And you'll notice that there's several sort of major water systems that are nearby as well. To the west, there is the Mediterranean Sea, which will take you to the northern coast of Africa and the southern coast of Europe, and eventually to the Atlantic Ocean. To the east, you have the Persian Gulf, which, if you follow the Persian Gulf, which has Iran or Persia on one side and Arabia on the other, you'll eventually get to the Indian Ocean, which takes you to, among other places, the Indian subcontinent. So that's roughly where we're talking about. So Mesopotamia, again, is the place. In terms of its physical properties, Mesopotamia is a desert. It is a hot, very hot even, often infertile and forbidding environment. The major exception to that hot desert environment is the land along the Tigris and the Euphrates itself. Those rivers, a little bit like the Nile in Egypt, create the possibility for life in an otherwise difficult environment. The rivers create rich alluvial soils, meaning their waters bring not only water, but also minerals that make the bordering lands fertile. The river is covered with swamps like you see in this picture. I'm not sure if this is the Tigris and the Euphrates, but it is from contemporary Iraq. It's covered with swamps as well as with reeds. And we'll see that reeds are actually very important to the reason why we have the Epic of Gilgamesh, the cultural work we'll be reading. The rivers provide a source of livelihood. They include fish, waterfowl, and on shore, dates, which is a major fruit and thus food source in this region. And obviously you can see where I'm getting with this. The rivers make agriculture and thus farming possible in this area, which is one of the reasons why Mesopotamia could be one of the first places where the Neolithic Revolution occurred. Also, the rivers provide transportation. It is worth noting that while the waters and the soils the waters bring are a significant source of life, that they do not provide everything. There is very little stone in this environment. The kind of flint tools that were so common in Western Europe and important to the Lascaux people would not be available here. There's also a notable lack of timber, a notable lack of trees. One of the more interesting, or one interesting passage in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and one way we can see that work of literature, in a sense, is kind of deeply embedded in its historical environment, is there's an interesting scene where Gilgamesh and his partner leave Mesopotamia and go on a kind of expedition for wood, for timber, in order to be able to build a city, essentially. And it's sort of generally considered that the land that they go off to corresponds to the modern country of Lebanon, which is sort of the only Middle Eastern country that does not have a lot of desert and that has a lot of forests, particularly cypress trees. And so it's generally kind of assumed that the story is about, an expedition from Mesopotamia to Lebanon to bring back wood, which again is lacking in Mesopotamia. Briefly, I'll just sort of say then that if Mesopotamia is the place, the land that we're talking about, the Sumerians are the people, okay? So the Sumerians are the name of one group. You could call it a sort of ethnicity, if you wanted, that lived in Mesopotamia at a very early stage in history. So later peoples or subsequent peoples will populate Mesopotamia after the Sumerians disappear from the historical record. So what we are looking at in this unit is the moment when the Sumerians inhabited Mesopotamia. The Sumerians are believed to have arrived in Mesopotamia around 4000 before the Common Era, which means 6,000 years ago. By the way, before the Common Era is sort of the current way that we say what used to be called before Christ. And so given that we are in the year 2020, i.e. technically, according to convention, 2020 years since the conventional date for the birth of Christ, anytime we use the term BCE, if you want to turn it into years ago, you add 2000 to it. Anyway, I'll close that parenthetical remark. So they arrived about 4,000 years ago. Little is known about their origin. They speak an isolated language, and we know this because, as I will describe, we can, meaning contemporary scholars can, read Sumerian. Okay, we know their language. And it is not connected to any other known language. In particular, they settled in southern Mesopotamia. I'll go back to my previous slide for just a moment. So if you see the area that is marked Sumer in the sort of right-hand side of the area between the two rivers, that is what we're really talking about, sort of the southern end of Mesopotamia, not far from where the rivers flow into the Persian Gulf. And around 3,500 BCE, what the Sumerians do is they create large cities, which are called city-states, which basically means politically independent cities. And it's these early cities that are made possible by the Neolithic Revolution that we're going to be looking at on Wednesday. And I'll also just sort of mention that at a certain point it's known that another people arrived in Mesopotamia and sort of blended in with the Sumerian people, and these are simply called the Semites. And these people do speak a language that we know is related to other languages and are ethnically connected to some other peoples, particularly the Hebrews and Arabs. So I've said a little bit about the Neolithic Revolution as the big turning point in human social organization, and I've cited the Sumerians of Mesopotamia as an example of them, and I've also sort of pointed out what the term Mesopotamia and Sumerians mean. I will be going into all this in much more detail on Wednesday. Please remember to do the reading assignment that I will send out shortly. I look forward to seeing the people watching this video, or at least most of them in any case, in class on Wednesday. Remember also that the optional Zoom meeting is being planned for Friday. As always, be in touch if there's ever any way that I can help you, or if you have any questions. I hope you have a good afternoon. Thanks.